Chapter 1. The Crimson Timepiece. The autumn of 1887 had proven particularly gloomy, with London's characteristic fog clinging persistently to the city like a burial shroud. It was during this dreary season that I found myself once again sharing quarters with my dear friend and colleague Sherlock Holmes at our lodgings in Baker Street. The conclusion of my medical practice had afforded me more time to accompany Holmes on his cases, though I confess that recent weeks had been remarkably devoid of any mysteries worthy of his exceptional talents. Holmes had fallen into one of his black moods that invariably accompanied such periods of inactivity. For 3 days he had barely spoken, alternating between violent bouts on his violin at ungodly hours and long periods of silent contemplation, surrounded by a haze of tobacco, smoke that hung thick in our sitting room. I had attempted to engage him in conversation several times, but was met with little more than monosyllabic responses or dismissive waves of his long, nimble fingers. "Watson," he said suddenly that evening, startling me from my reading of the evening paper, "do you not find it curious that London's criminal classes have descended into such utter banality? Not a single crime of note in weeks. Nothing but petty thefts and domestic disagreements." He sighed dramatically, casting aside a telegram he had been examining. "I feel my faculties atrophying by the hour. Perhaps you should consider it a blessing," I offered, "that the citizens of London are enjoying a respite from heinous crimes." Holmes scoffed. "A blessing for them, perhaps, but a curse for me. The mind rebels at stagnation, Watson. Give me problems, give me work." He strode to the window, pulling back the curtain to peer into the fog-shrouded street below. "Without data, my brain is like an engine racing out of gear, tearing itself to pieces." As if in direct response to his lament, the sharp ring of our doorbell echoed through the house, followed by hurried footsteps upon the stairs. Holmes turned, his keen eyes suddenly alight with interest. "Late caller," he murmured, glancing at the mantelpiece clock which showed 9:30. "Urgent business, judging by the pressure applied to the bell and the rapidity of footsteps. A gentleman of means, but one who has travelled some distance today through uncertain conditions." Before I could inquire how he had deduced such specific details, Mrs. Hudson knocked and entered, announcing, "Sir Arthur Blackwood to see you, Mr. Holmes. He insists the matter cannot wait until morning." Holmes's thin lips curved into a satisfied smile. "Show him in at once, Mrs. Hudson." The man who entered our sitting room moments later was tall and distinguished, though visibly agitated. His immaculate frock coat and pristine collar spoke of wealth, yet his mud-spattered boots and the dishevelment of his normally well-groomed appearance suggested recent travel under distressing circumstances. He clutched his hat tightly in gloved hands that trembled slightly. "Mr. Holmes," he began, without preamble, "I am Sir Arthur Blackwood. Forgive this unannounced intrusion, but I find myself confronted with circumstances so bizarre, so utterly incomprehensible, that I can turn to no one else." "Pray, take a seat, Sir Arthur," Holmes directed, gesturing to the chair across from his own. "This is my trusted friend and colleague, Dr. Watson, who assists me in my investigations. You may speak freely before him." Sir Arthur collapsed into the offered chair. Upon closer inspection, I noted the pallor of his complexion and the haunted look in his eyes, signs I had often observed in those who had witnessed something beyond their understanding. "I reside at Blackwood Manor in Essex," he began, his voice steadier now. "It is a family estate, passed down through generations since the time of Elizabeth I. 3 days ago, I received a most unusual package. It contained a clock, an antique timepiece of remarkable craftsmanship, though one I had never seen before." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Was there any indication of who sent this gift? "None whatsoever," Sir Arthur replied. "It arrived without note or explanation, addressed simply to Sir Arthur Blackwood, Blackwood Manor, Essex. I assumed initially it was from a business associate or distant relative, though the lack of accompanying message seemed peculiar." "Describe this clock, if you would," Holmes prompted. "It stands approximately 15 inches tall, crafted of dark mahogany with intricate brass fittings. The face is alabaster white with Roman numerals, and the pendulum appears to be solid gold. It is by all accounts a magnificent piece that would not look out of place among the finest collections." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "And what events prompted this urgent visit to Baker Street?" Sir Arthur's composure faltered. "Last night at precisely midnight, I was awakened by the sound of the clock chiming, though it had not functioned since its arrival. I descended to my study where I had placed it upon the mantel, and discovered—" He paused, as if struggling to articulate what he had witnessed. "The clock was bleeding, Mr. Holmes." "Bleeding?" I interjected, unable to contain my astonishment. "Yes, Doctor." A thick, crimson substance oozed from between the wooden joints of the case, pooling on my mantelpiece and dripping onto the hearth below. I thought perhaps my sleep-addled mind was playing tricks, but when I approached to examine it more closely, I found the substance warm to the touch, and with the unmistakable metallic scent of blood. Holmes remained impassive, though I detected the slight arching of his eyebrow that indicated his interest had been thoroughly piqued. "When morning came," Sir Arthur continued, "there was no trace of the substance. The clock appeared as it had upon arrival, an elegant antique, nothing more. I convinced myself it had been a vivid nightmare, brought on perhaps by the port I had consumed before retiring. But tonight—" His voice broke. "Tonight it happened again, precisely at midnight. The chiming, the bleeding, and this time there was a message." "A message?" Holmes repeated, his voice sharp with sudden intensity. Sir Arthur reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, passing it to Holmes with a trembling hand. This appeared beneath the clock, written in what I can only presume is the same substance that leaked from the timepiece. Holmes carefully unfolded the paper, his grey eyes scanning the contents before passing it to me. Written in a brownish red, script that had dried to a crusted texture, were the words, "Time reveals all sins. Yours returns at midnight." "Most intriguing," Holmes murmured. "And you have no notion what this message might reference? No past indiscretion or family secret that could explain such an ominous warning? None that would warrant this?" Sir Arthur insisted, though a flicker of something, doubt perhaps or concealed knowledge, passed briefly across his features. Holmes rose abruptly, pacing the length of our sitting-room with the nervous energy that always accompanied the initial stages of an engaging case. "I shall need to examine this clock personally, Sir Arthur. Can you arrange for us to visit Blackwood Manor tomorrow?" "Of course. I shall send my carriage for you at first light." "Excellent." Holmes stopped pacing, and fixed our visitor with a shy, penetrating stare. "Until then, I advise you to touch nothing in the study where the clock resides. Leave it exactly as it is, and perhaps most importantly, Sir Arthur, consider carefully if there is anything else you should tell me. The smallest detail may prove crucial in matters such as these." Sir Arthur nodded gravely. "I understand, Mr. Holmes. I shall expect you tomorrow morning." He rose to leave, but hesitated. "Do you believe, sir, that there is a rational explanation for what I've witnessed? I am not a fanciful man, yet I find myself contemplating the most supernatural possibilities." A thin smile played at the corners of Holmes's mouth. "In my experience, Sir Arthur, the most fantastical appearances often conceal the most mundane realities. There is invariably a logical explanation, though uncovering it may require us to discard conventional thinking. Rest assured, we shall get to the bottom of your bleeding clock." After our visitor had departed, I turned to Holmes, who had already begun filling his pipe with his favourite shag tobacco. "What do you make of it, Holmes? Surely you don't believe a clock could actually bleed?" "What I believe, Watson, is that we have been presented with a case of remarkable peculiarity," he replied, striking a match and applying it to his pipe. "A mysterious timepiece, a message written in blood, and a clearly terrified baronet who, unless I miss my guess, is concealing something significant." He exhaled a cloud of smoke with evident satisfaction. "The game is afoot, my friend, and not a moment too soon. I was beginning to fear my brain would calcify from disuse." I smiled, recognizing the familiar gleam in his eye that signaled the awakening of his formidable intellect. "Then I shall prepare to accompany you to Essex tomorrow." "Indeed you shall, Watson. I predict that the clock at Blackwood Manor will prove most illuminating, particularly if it should bleed again at midnight." As I retired to my room that night, I could hear Holmes moving about restlessly below, no doubt already formulating theories about the bizarre case that had so fortuitously landed in our laps. I fell asleep to the distant sound of his violin, playing a contemplative melody that seemed to echo the mysterious ticking of a clock that bled at midnight. Chapter 2. The journey to Blackwood Manor dawn had barely broken over London when Holmes roused me from sleep. The fog had lifted somewhat, though a fine drizzle now descended upon the city streets, lending everything a glistening, ethereal quality. True to his word, Sir Arthur had sent his carriage, an elegant black landau drawn by a matched pair of greys, which awaited us at the curb outside 221B Baker Street. "You've packed your revolver, I trust?" Holmes inquired as we descended the stairs. "I have," I confirmed, patting my coat pocket. Years of association with Holmes had taught me to be prepared for any eventuality, though I can scarcely imagine needing it to confront a bleeding timepiece. Holmes smiled thinly. "One never knows, Watson. The clock itself presents a curious problem, but I suspect it is merely the visible manifestation of a more conventional threat." The journey to Essex passed largely in silence. Holmes appeared deep in contemplation, his keen eyes occasionally darting to observe the passing countryside, though I knew his mind was elsewhere, already dissecting the bizarre case that lay before us. For my part, I reviewed the scant details we possessed, finding myself unable to formulate any rational explanation for a clock that leaked blood and delivered threatening messages. What do you make of Sir Arthur?" I ventured after some time. Holmes emerged from his reverie, a man of means and education, approximately 50 years of age, widowed, I believe, with no children. His estate is likely entailed, passing through the male line. Most notably, he is deeply troubled, not merely by the supernatural appearance of his mysterious clock, but by something more fundamental. He tapped his long fingers against his knee. "Did you observe his reaction when I inquired about past indiscretions?" "I noticed a certain hesitation," I admitted. "Precisely. The momentary aversion of his gaze, the slight tension in his jaw. Sir, Arthur Blackwood harbours a secret, Watson, one that he believes may be connected to his bleeding clock. Do you suspect foul play?" "I suspect nothing yet," Holmes replied. "But I intend to learn everything there is to know about Blackwood Manor and its master before this day is through." The manor house, when we arrived shortly before noon, proved to be a magnificent Tudor structure, its timber-framed facade speaking to centuries of history. Ivy climbed its ancient walls, and diamond-paned windows gleamed dully in the weak sunlight. A sense of brooding isolation hung about the place, enhanced by the surrounding woods, which seemed to press in upon the manicured gardens like sentinels. Sir Arthur himself greeted us at the entrance. His appearance marginally improved from the previous evening, though the haunted look remained in his eyes. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming so promptly," he said, ushering us into a grand entrance hall, adorned with ancestral portraits and hunting trophies. "Nothing further has occurred since last night, though I confess I've avoided the study entirely." "Most wise," Holmes commented. "Pray, show us to this room at once." The study proved to be a handsome chamber lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large mahogany desk. A fire burned low in the grate, above which stood the mantelpiece where the clock was positioned. Even from the doorway, I could appreciate the craftsmanship of the timepiece, its dark wood gleaming with polish, brass fittings catching the firelight. It appeared utterly ordinary, giving no hint of the macabre phenomenon Sir Arthur had described. Holmes approached it carefully, removing his lens from his pocket to examine the clock from every angle without touching it. He studied the mantelpiece, beneath, running his finger along the polished wood surface. "There are indeed traces of some dried substance here," he murmured. "And observe these fine scratches around the base of the clock, Watson, suggesting it has been moved recently, despite its apparent weight." Sir Arthur shifted uncomfortably. "I assure you, Mr. Holmes, I have not touched it since placing it there upon its arrival." Holmes replied non-committally. "Tell me, Sir Arthur, who else resides at Blackwood Manor?" "Only my staff, Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, Jenkins, my valet, cook and 2 kitchen maids, Thomas, who tends the grounds, and Phillips, who serves as butler and footman." He hesitated. "And my late brother's widow, Lady Eleanor Blackwood, who occupies the east wing." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "You did not mention Lady Eleanor yesterday." "I did not think her relevant to the matter at hand. She rarely leaves her quarters and would have no cause to enter my study." "I see." Holmes continued his examination of the room, his gaze sweeping methodically across every surface. "And when did your brother pass away?" 3 years ago this December," Sir Arthur replied, a shadow crossing his features. A hunting accident. Most tragic, indeed. Holmes knelt suddenly, examining something on the hearth rug. And his widow chose to remain at Blackwood Manor rather than returning to her family. Eleanor had nowhere else to go. Her family's circumstances are reduced. I could hardly turn her out. Holmes nodded, pocketing something from the floor before rising. Most commendable. Now, Sir Arthur, I should like to examine the packaging in which this clock arrived, if you still have it. Of course, I instructed Jenkins to preserve it. He tugged the bell pull, and moments later a tall, austere man appeared. Jenkins, fetch the packaging from the delivery 3 days ago. As Jenkins departed, Holmes turned his attention to the Eyre bookshelves, scanning the titles with interest. You have an impressive collection on horology, Sir Arthur. A particular interest of yours? Sir Arthur appeared startled. My father's passion rather than mine. I've never taken to it myself. Yet you recognize the exceptional craftsmanship of this mysterious timepiece, Holmes observed. Curious. Jenkins returned with a wooden crate and several sheets of brown paper. Holmes examined these with characteristic thoroughness, particularly the address label, which he held up to the light. The handwriting is distinctive, educated but affected. The postmark is smudged, but one can make out London at least. He sniffed the paper. Interesting? Have you discovered something, Mr. Holmes? Sir Arthur asked anxiously. Several things, Holmes replied enigmatically. But I require more data before forming conclusions. I should like to speak with Lady Eleanor, and then perhaps tour the grounds. Sir Arthur's discomfort was palpable. Eleanor is not well today. Perhaps tomorrow. I'm perfectly well enough to receive visitors, Arthur. The voice from the doorway drew our attention. The woman who stood there was striking. Perhaps 35 years of age, with auburn hair swept into an elegant coiffure, and penetrating green eyes that assessed us coolly. Her black mourning dress, though 3 years after her bereavement, emphasized her pale complexion. Lady Eleanor. Holmes bowed slightly. Sherlock Holmes, at your service. This is my colleague, Dr. Watson. I know who you are, Mr. Holmes, she replied with the ghost of a smile. The question is why you are here, examining my late husband's clock. Chapter 3. Secrets of the East Wing. Sir Arthur's face drained of colour at Lady Eleanor's words. Eleanor, you are mistaken. This clock was delivered only 3 days ago. Lady Eleanor swept into the room, her movements graceful despite the rigidity of her posture. I am not mistaken, Arthur. That is Charles's anniversary clock, the one that disappeared after his death. She approached the mantelpiece, her eyes fixed on the timepiece with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest. I searched everywhere for it. How convenient that it should suddenly reappear now. Holmes watched this exchange with evident fascination, his keen eyes darting between the two. Most intriguing. Lady Eleanor, you are certain this is the same clock that belonged to your late husband? Without question, she replied firmly. Charles commissioned it from Thornwald and Sons in London for our 10th wedding anniversary. See, this small notch on the right corner. He accidentally caused that when moving it from his study to our drawing room. Sir Arthur made a dismissive gesture. Many clocks might have similar markings. Eleanor, you're upset. Perhaps you should rest. We can discuss this later. I am perfectly composed, Arthur, and I wish to speak with Mr. Holmes. Her voice carried a steel edge that brooked no argument. Privately, if you please. An uncomfortable silence descended upon the room. Holmes glanced at Sir Arthur, whose expression had hardened into one of barely contained irritation. Perhaps, Holmes suggested diplomatically, you might show Dr. Watson the grounds, Sir Arthur, while I speak with Lady Eleanor. The exterior of the manor is most impressive, and I would value Watson's observations of the surroundings. Though clearly reluctant, Sir Arthur nodded stiffly. Very well. This way, Doctor. As they departed, Holmes gestured for Lady Eleanor to take a seat. Now, Lady Eleanor, pray tell me about this clock and your late husband. She settled into a chair, arranging her morning dress with practiced precision. Charles, Sir Charles Blackwood, was Arthur's older brother and the previous baronet. We were married for 12 years before his accident. A shadow crossed her fine features. He was devoted to his collections, particularly his timepieces. This clock was special to him, specially commissioned, as I mentioned. And it vanished after his death. Yes, after the funeral, I noticed it missing from his study. Arthur claimed to know nothing of its whereabouts. She glanced toward the door, lowering her voice. Our relationship has been strained since Charles's death. Arthur resented our marriage from the beginning. He believed I married Charles for his fortune and position. And did you? Holmes asked bluntly. Rather than taking offence, Lady Eleanor smiled faintly. Refreshingly direct, Mr. Holmes. I married Charles because he was kind, intelligent, and saw me as more than a decorative object. That he was wealthy was undeniably fortunate, given my family's circumstances, but it was not my primary motivation. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. Tell me about the hunting accident. A flicker of pain crossed her face. It was December 12th, 1884. Charles went shooting with Arthur and some local gentlemen. They returned without him. Arthur claiming Charles had slipped on wet rocks while crossing Blackwood Stream. His gun discharged, killing him instantly. She paused, twisting the black mourning ring on her finger. I never believed it was an accident. You suspect foul play. I have no proof, Mr. Holmes. Merely a wife's intuition and certain inconsistencies in the accounts given. Such as, Charles was meticulous about gun safety. He would never have carried a loaded weapon so carelessly. And the location. He knew that crossing was treacherous in winter. He would have used the bridge half a mile downstream. Holmes leaned forward, his expression intent. Did you share these concerns with the authorities? I tried. The local magistrate is a close friend of Arthur's. My concerns were dismissed as a widow's hysteria. Bitterness tinged her voice. Since then, I've been effectively confined to the East Wing, living on Arthur's charity, while he controls Charles's estate. The inheritance passed to him rather than to you. The entailed property and title, yes. I receive a modest widow's allowance, but the bulk of Charles's personal fortune should have come to me through his will. Her green eyes flashed. A will that mysteriously disappeared along with certain other items, including that clock. Holmes rose, pacing the room with his hands clasped behind his back. And now the clock reappears, bleeding at midnight with threatening messages. Most curious. He stopped abruptly. I should like to see your husband's former rooms in the east wing, if you would be so kind." Lady Eleanor hesitated only momentarily before nodding. "Of course, follow me." The east wing of Blackwood Manor proved markedly different from the well-maintained areas we had previously seen. Though clean, it had an air of neglect. Wallpaper fading, carpets worn thin in places. Lady Eleanor led Holmes through a maze of corridors to a set of rooms that had clearly once been a gentleman's personal apartment. "Charles's study remains largely as he left it," she explained, opening a heavy oak door. "Arthur allowed me to maintain it. Perhaps the one kindness he has shown." The room beyond was handsomely appointed, with leather-bound books lining the walls and a massive desk dominating the centre. A portrait above the fireplace showed a distinguished gentleman with intelligent eyes and a trimmed beard. Sir Charles Blackwood, presumably. Holmes examined the room methodically, paying particular attention to the empty space on a side table. The clock stood here. Yes, Charles kept it on that table, where he could admire it while working. Holmes ran his fingers over the surface, then knelt to examine the carpet beneath. There are indentations consistent with a heavy object having stood here for years. He rose, moving to the bookshelf. "Your husband shared his brother's interest in horology. Charles was the true enthusiast. Arthur merely pretends knowledge to impress his London acquaintances." She moved to the bookshelf, removing a leather-bound volume. Charles kept meticulous records of his collection in this journal, each piece catalogued with its history and value. Holmes accepted the journal with evident interest, flipping through the pages until he stopped at an entry accompanied by a detailed sketch. "The clock in question, I presume?" "Yes. You see here where he notes the commissioning date and the craftsman's name. Thornwald and Sons, 1877. Holmes read aloud. "And this notation at the bottom. Mechanism modified by TB as per instructions. What does that signify?" Lady Eleanor frowned slightly. "I'm not certain. Charles often had pieces customized to his specifications, but he rarely discussed the technical details with me." Holmes continued examining the journal before closing it decisively. "May I borrow this temporarily? It could prove invaluable to our investigation." "Of course." She hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "Mr. Holmes, there is something else you should know. 3 days ago, the same day Arthur claims the clock was delivered, I received this." She withdrew a folded paper from her dress pocket and handed it to him. Holmes unfolded it carefully. Written in an elegant, flowing script were the words, "Justice comes at midnight. Be prepared." "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured. "Did you show this to Sir Arthur?" "No, our interactions are limited, and frankly, I was unsure what to make of it until hearing about the clock's reappearance and its midnight activity." Holmes pocketed the note. "You were wise to share this with me, Lady Eleanor. Now, I believe we should rejoin Sir Arthur and Dr. Watson before your brother-in-law grows suspicious of our extended conversation." As they made their way back through the corridors, Holmes suddenly asked, "One final question, if I may. Do you know of anyone with the initials TB? Perhaps among your husband's acquaintances or business associates?" Lady Eleanor paused mid-step, her expression troubled. "Thomas Blackwood, Arthur and Charles's younger brother. He disappeared 15 years ago after a bitter quarrel with Arthur. Charles always believed he went to America. A third brother." Holmes mused. "How very interesting that Sir Arthur failed to mention him entirely." Chapter 4. The Hidden Mechanism. Upon rejoining Sir Arthur and myself in the garden, Holmes betrayed nothing of what he had learned from Lady Eleanor. He merely commented on the impressive topiary and inquired about the history of the estates, grounds with such casual interest that even I, who knew him well, could detect no underlying purpose to his questions. Sir Arthur, visibly relieved to find his sister-in-law no longer present, readily expounded on the generations of Blackwoods who had shaped the surrounding parkland. As we made our way back toward the manor house, Holmes suddenly stopped beside a small stone outbuilding partially concealed by ivy. "Your workshop, Sir Arthur?" he inquired, nodding toward the structure. Sir Arthur appeared momentarily taken aback. "Yes, though I'm surprised you identified it as such. I dabble in mechanical repairs, a hobby that helps occupy my evenings. The windows are fitted with metal shutters rather than standard glass, ideal for containing the noise and sparks of metalwork," Holmes observed. "Might we see inside?" "It's rather disorganized at present," Sir Arthur demurred. "Perhaps after luncheon. I'm particularly interested in examining any tools that might be used for clockwork mechanisms." Holmes interrupted, his tone light but insistent. A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps or concern, crossed Sir Arthur's features before his hospitable smile returned. "Very well, though I fear you'll find nothing of consequence." The interior of the workshop confirmed Holmes's suspicion. A well-equipped space with lathes, files, and various specialized tools hanging in precise order along the walls. A workbench dominated the center, its surface meticulously clean, save for a small brass component that Sir Arthur hastily pocketed upon our entrance. "You are more than a dabbler, I think," Holmes remarked, examining a finely crafted set of watchmaker's tools. "These are professional instruments. Merely expensive toys for a man with too much time and money," Sir Arthur replied with a self-deprecating laugh. "My late brother collected timepieces. I prefer to understand their inner workings." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Did you share this interest with Charles?" "Hardly. Charles was interested only in acquisition and display. The mechanical aspects were beneath his concern." A hint of bitterness coloured his tone. "But you didn't come to Essex to discuss my hobbies, Mr. Holmes. What of the clock? Have you formed any theories about last night's phenomenon?" "Several," Holmes replied enigmatically, "though I require more data before drawing conclusions. I should like to examine the clock more thoroughly. With your permission, I'd like to dismantle it." Sir Arthur's reaction was immediate and forceful. "Absolutely not. It's a valuable antique. If you damage it, I assure you I am quite skilled in horological mechanics," Holmes countered smoothly. "But if you prefer, we can simply wait until midnight to observe the bleeding firsthand." After a moment's hesitation, Sir Arthur nodded stiffly. "Very well. We shall wait." The remainder of the day passed with excruciating slowness. We dined with Sir Arthur in a formal dining room beneath the stern gazes of Blackwood ancestors whose portraits lined the panelled walls. Lady Eleanor did not join us, having sent word that she would take her meal in her rooms, an arrangement that appeared to be the household's normal practice. Over brandy and cigars, Holmes engaged our host in seemingly idle conversation about the family history, the local area, and Sir Arthur's relationship with his late brother. Though his manner remained affable, I recognized the calculated purpose Behind each question, Holmes was constructing a mental framework into which he could fit the curious facts of our case. "Your family has held this estate since Elizabethan times?" Holmes inquired, examining the amber liquid in his glass. "Indeed. The first Sir William Blackwood was granted the lands in 1573 for service to the Crown." Pride was evident in Sir Arthur's voice. The Blackwoods have maintained the estate through civil war, economic hardship, and numerous political upheavals. "Always passing to the eldest son, I presume?" "Without exception." Sir Arthur took a contemplative sip of brandy. "My brother was not blessed with children. Providence determined that the responsibility would fall to me." "And should anything happen to you?" Holmes asked with studied casualness. "Is there another heir?" Sir Arthur's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "A distant cousin in Northumberland would inherit. I've never met the man." "No thought of marriage yourself? Continuing the direct line at my age?" Sir Arthur forced a laugh. "I'm set in my bachelor ways, Mr. Holmes. The Blackwood name may end with me, but the estate will survive." As the clock in the hallway struck 11, Sir Arthur suggested we retire to the study to await the midnight hour. The three of us settled into leather armchairs, arranged in a semicircle facing the mantelpiece, where the mysterious timepiece stood silent and seemingly innocent in the firelight. Holmes, rather than watching the clock, observed Sir Arthur with subtle intensity. Our host appeared increasingly agitated as midnight approached, checking his pocket watch repeatedly, shifting in his chair, and drinking more brandy than was his custom, judging by the surprised glance of Jenkins when instructed to bring a second decanter. At 11:45, Holmes broke the tense silence. "I understand your brother had a passion for mechanical puzzles and trick devices, Sir Arthur. The journal of his collection mentions several ingenious items with hidden compartments and secret mechanisms." Sir Arthur started slightly. "You've seen Charles's journal? I was unaware it still existed. Lady Eleanor was kind enough to share it." Holmes replied mildly. "Fascinating reading. Your brother had quite an eye for unusual timepieces. Eleanor should have respected his privacy," Sir Arthur muttered. Then, seeming to recollect himself, he added more civilly, "Though I suppose it hardly matters now." At 5 minutes to midnight, Holmes rose and approached the clock, circling it with careful scrutiny. "The craftsmanship is indeed exceptional. Thornwald and Sons were masters of their art." "You're familiar with their work?" Sir Arthur asked, surprise evident in his tone. "I make it my business to know such things," Holmes replied vaguely, his attention fixed on the clock. "Ah, observe, the minute hand approaches 12. The three of us watched in tense anticipation as the hand crept toward its zenith. As it aligned perfectly with the hour hand, the clock began to chime, a rich, resonant sound that seemed impossibly loud in the hushed room. On the 12th stroke, a thin line of crimson liquid began to seep from the seam where the clock face met the wooden case, rolling down the polished mahogany like tears of blood. "Good God," I whispered, rising from my chair. Holmes, rather than appearing shocked, looked almost satisfied. He extracted a small glass vial from his pocket and carefully collected a sample of the substance. "Fascinating. And now, Sir Arthur, do you still object to my examining the mechanism?" Our host had gone deathly pale, his eyes fixed on the bleeding timepiece. "Do what you must," he whispered hoarsely. Without hesitation, Holmes carefully lifted the clock and carried it to Sir Arthur's desk, where better light would facilitate his examination. From his pocket he produced a set of small tools, a fact that suggested he had anticipated this moment, and began to work on the rear panel of the case. "Just as I suspected," he announced after a moment, beckoning us closer. "Observe this secondary reservoir connected to the main clockwork. When the hands align at midnight, this lever activates, releasing the liquid through these tiny channels." "But what is the substance?" I asked, peering at the ingenious mechanism. "It appears to be blood." "That remains to be determined," Holmes replied, collecting another sample. "Though I doubt very much it's human blood, despite appearances." As he worked, a small folded paper became visible, tucked behind the clock's mechanism. Holmes extracted it carefully, unfolding it to reveal a message written in the same red substance. "The debt comes due. 3 days remain." Sir Arthur, reading over Holmes's shoulder, staggered back as though physically struck. "What does it mean?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Who is doing this?" Holmes fixed him with a penetrating stare. "I believe you already know, Sir Arthur. The question is whether you intend to pay the debt before your time runs out." Chapter 5. The Testament. Sir Arthur collapsed into his chair. The blood drained from his face. For several moments he sat in shocked silence, his eyes fixed on the threatening note in Holmes's hand. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its aristocratic composure. "This is madness," he whispered. "Absolute madness." Holmes regarded him steadily. I think the time has come for complete honesty, Sir Arthur. What debt is being referenced here? Who might harbour such a grievance against you?" The baronet's hand trembled as he reached for his brandy glass. "I cannot say." "Cannot or will not?" Holmes pressed, his tone hardening. "A man is sending you threatening messages in a most theatrical manner. Your fear is palpable. These are not the actions of a prankster, but of someone with serious intent. Someone who believes you owe a significant debt." Sir Arthur's gaze darted toward the door, as though ensuring our privacy. "Mr. Holmes, some family matters are best left buried. I invited you here to investigate a strange occurrence, not to dredge up ancient history." "I fear the two are inextricably linked," Holmes replied. "The bleeding clock belonged to your brother Charles. It disappeared after his death, and has now mysteriously returned with threats suggesting a debt coming due. The coincidences are too numerous to ignore." Our host's composure cracked further. "How could you possibly know the clock was Charles's?" Lady Eleanor identified it immediately. She also mentioned a third brother, Thomas, whose existence you neglected to share. At the mention of Thomas Blackwood, Sir Arthur's expression transformed from fear to something darker, a mixture of anger and what appeared to be genuine grief. Thomas was dead to this family long before he physically disappeared. "What caused the rift?" I inquired, speaking for the first time since the clock had revealed its midnight message. Sir Arthur hesitated, then sighed deeply, seeming to recognize the futility of further evasion. Thomas was brilliant but unstable, a mechanical genius who could have achieved greatness had he not been consumed by his unconventional ideas. He studied at Cambridge briefly before being sent down for what the university termed dangerous experimentation. "What sort of experimentation?" Holmes asked, He became obsessed with the concept of embedding messages or mechanisms within seemingly ordinary objects, particularly clocks and watches. He claimed timepieces represented the perfect metaphor for fate and consequences. Sir Arthur shook his head. After Cambridge, he established a small workshop in London. Charles, always the indulgent older brother, supported him financially despite my objections. And this caused tension between you and Charles? Charles was too soft-hearted for his own good. Thomas took advantage of his generosity for years. Bitterness crept into Sir Arthur's voice. Then came the final insult. Charles commissioned that very clock from Thomas for his 10th wedding anniversary. A recognition of Thomas's skill that I found utterly misplaced. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. You said the clock came from Thornwald and Sons. That was the pretense. In truth, Thomas created it under their supervision. The journal notation TB confirms as much. What happened to drive Thomas away 15 years ago? Holmes inquired, carefully returning the disassembled clock to the desk. Sir Arthur's expression darkened further. Thomas became increasingly erratic. He developed an unhealthy obsession with what he called mechanical justice. Devices that would right perceived wrongs through clever mechanisms. When our father died, leaving the bulk of his personal fortune to Charles and myself, rather than dividing it equally among the three of us, Thomas was incensed. He felt cheated of his inheritance, I observed. Precisely, Doctor. He confronted Charles and me here at Blackwood Manor, making wild accusations and threatening to expose supposed family secrets. Sir Arthur took another drink of brandy. I lost my temper. Words were exchanged that could not be taken back. Thomas left that night, vowing that someday we would pay for our betrayal. We never saw him again. Did you attempt to locate him? Holmes asked. Charles did for several years. He eventually heard rumours that Thomas had sailed for America. Sir Arthur set down his glass with finality. Until today, I believed him long dead. Holmes paced the room, hands clasped behind his back, a habit that indicated intense thought. The timing is significant. The clock arrives exactly 3 years after your brother Charles's death, bleeding at midnight with messages suggesting retribution. The evidence points to Thomas Blackwood, having returned to settle what he perceives as an old score. But why now? After 15 years, I questioned. The 3rd anniversary of Charles's death approaches. Holmes mused. In many cultures, 3 years marks the end of the formal mourning period. Perhaps our clockmaker felt it an appropriate moment for his return. He turned to Sir Arthur. You believe the threat is directed solely at you? Sir Arthur shifted uncomfortably. Who else would it concern? Eleanor was always Thomas's ally. He harboured a peculiar fondness for her, though she was Charles's wife. Curious that you mentioned Lady Eleanor, Holmes remarked. She received her own message 3 days ago, on the same day the clock arrived. What? Sir Arthur started. She said nothing of this to me. The communication was brief, but suggestive. Justice comes at midnight. Be prepared. Holmes extracted the note from his pocket. The handwriting matches that on the packaging in which the clock arrived. Sir Arthur examined the paper with evident disquiet. Thomas always had distinctive penmanship, the result of his mechanical drafting, I suppose. Holmes retrieved his pipe from his pocket. filling it methodically as he continued to pace. "Sir Arthur, I must ask directly, is there any reason Thomas might hold you responsible for Charles's death?" The question hung in the air like gun smoke. Sir Arthur's face contorted briefly before settling into careful neutrality. "Absolutely not. Charles's death was a tragic accident, nothing more. Yet Lady Eleanor harbours doubts about the circumstances," Holmes observed. "She mentioned inconsistencies in the accounts given." "Eleanor was grief-stricken and seeking someone to blame," Sir Arthur replied dismissively. "The local magistrate thoroughly investigated and found nothing suspicious. I see." Holmes lit his pipe, his expression unreadable through the rising smoke. "And the matter of Charles's will? I understand it disappeared after his death." A flash of genuine surprise crossed Sir Arthur's features. "How could you possibly—" "Yes, Charles's will was among several items that went missing after his death. The family solicitor possessed a copy, however, which was duly executed, leaving the estate to you with a modest allowance for Lady Eleanor. The estate was entailed. It would have come to me regardless. The allowance was Charles's personal bequest to Eleanor." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "One final question, if I may. The grandfather clock in your hallway. I noticed it bears the Thornwald and Sons maker's mark, yet its style is distinctly similar to the smaller clock that now bleeds on your mantelpiece." Sir Arthur stiffened. "The Thornwald grandfather clock has stood in that hallway for 2 generations. It has no connection to Thomas or this current unpleasantness. I wonder," Holmes murmured almost to himself, "tomorrow, with your permission, I should like to examine it more closely." He turned to me. "Watson, perhaps we should retire. Tomorrow promises to be an eventful day." As we made our way up the grand staircase to our assigned rooms, I kept my voice low. "You don't believe Sir Arthur's account of Charles's death, do you, Holmes? I believe Sir Arthur has shared some truths while carefully concealing others," Holmes replied softly. "Note how readily he attributed the clock's creation to Thomas once confronted, yet initially claimed ignorance of its origins. And his reaction to the mention of Charles's will was most telling. You suspect foul play in Charles's death. Could Thomas be seeking revenge for his brother's murder?" Holmes's eyes gleamed in the dim light of the corridor. "All evidence points to a carefully orchestrated scheme, years in the making. But whether Thomas Blackwood is the architect of justice, or merely its instrument, remains to be seen." He paused at his door. "One thing is certain, Watson. Before this case concludes, we shall witness the resolution of a family tragedy long in the brewing." As I entered my own room, the distant chiming of the grandfather clock marked the half-hour past midnight, its sonorous tones echoing through the ancient corridors of Blackwood Manor, like a portent of revelations yet to come. Chapter 6. The Grandfather's Testimony. I awoke to find Holmes already dressed and pacing our shared sitting room, his lean face animated with the energy that always accompanied his deepest intellectual engagements. Dawn had barely broken, casting long shadows through the leaded windows of Blackwood Manor. "Ah, Watson, you're awake," he greeted me. "I've been contemplating the curious relationship between our 3 Blackwood brothers. Family dynamics often provide the key to seemingly inexplicable events. Have you formed a theory?" I inquired, accepting the cup of tea he offered. "Several. though I require more data before committing to any particular conclusion." He gestured toward the door. "I'm particularly eager to examine that grandfather clock while the household slumbers." Sir Arthur's reaction to my interest was most revealing. We descended the grand staircase quietly, the ancient oak steps creaking beneath our weight despite our caution. The entrance hall lay in shadow, illuminated only by the grey light filtering through the high windows. The grandfather clock stood against the far wall, its polished mahogany case gleaming dully in the half-light. Holmes approached it with the reverence of a scholar examining a rare manuscript. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, the clock bore the unmistakable hallmarks of exceptional craftsmanship. Intricate carvings adorned its crown, while the clock face displayed not only the time, but the phases of the moon and movement of celestial bodies. "Exquisite workmanship," Holmes murmured, extracting his lens to study the maker's mark. "Thornwald and Sons, 1872, the same period when Thomas Blackwood would have been beginning his horological education." He ran his fingers along the wood, searching for hidden catches or compartments. "The similarities to our bleeding timepiece are unmistakable. Observe the distinctive scrollwork around the face. You believe Thomas created this clock as well?" "I believe Thomas modified it at some point," Holmes replied, carefully opening the front panel to reveal the pendulum and weights. "Ah, most interesting. What have you found?" "The movement appears standard at first glance, but observe these additional gears and this small compartment behind the pendulum. Most unusual in a clock of this period." Holmes extracted a thin metal tool from his pocket and carefully probed the hidden compartment. After a moment of delicate manipulation, a small click sounded, and a concealed drawer, no larger than a snuff-box, slid open at the base of the pendulum housing. "Ingenious," Holmes breathed, reaching carefully into the space. He withdrew a small brass key with an ornate head. "The craftsmanship matches that of our bleeding clock, clearly the work of the same hand." As he held the key up to examine it, in the strengthening morning light, a door opened at the far end of the hall. Lady Eleanor emerged, wrapped in a dark blue dressing gown, her auburn hair falling loose about her shoulders. She started at the sight of us. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you're abroad early," she observed, approaching with cautious curiosity. "A habit of mine, Lady Eleanor," Holmes replied smoothly, subtly pocketing the key. "I find the early morning hours most conducive to clear thinking." Her gaze fell upon the open clock case. "You're examining Charles's father's clock. You identified it as belonging to the previous generation?" Holmes inquired. "Yes, the old baronet commissioned it shortly before his death. Charles told me it was one of Thomas's first major projects under Thornwald's supervision." She stepped closer, her expression softening with memory. "Charles was immensely proud of his brother's craftsmanship, though Arthur always dismissed Thomas's talents. Did you know Thomas well before his disappearance?" A shadow crossed her face. "I married Charles 10 years after Thomas had gone. I knew him only through Charles's stories and a few letters they exchanged in the early years of our marriage." "Letters?" Holmes's interest visibly sharpened. Sir Arthur gave the impression all contact had been severed. Arthur never knew. The communications came through a mutual friend in London who had encountered Thomas in America. She hesitated. "Charles kept them locked in his desk. After his death, They disappeared along with several other personal items, including his will, Holmes observed. Lady Eleanor's green eyes widened. You know about the will. Sir Arthur mentioned it was among the items that went missing, though he assured me a copy existed with the family solicitor. A convenient copy that left me with a pittance while Arthur gained control of Charles's personal fortune, as well as the entailed estate. Bitterness tinged her voice. The original will left specific bequests, including this house for my lifetime use. Regardless of who inherited the title, the copy conveniently omitted those provisions. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. Lady Eleanor, did Charles ever mention any hiding places or secret compartments within the manor? Places where he might have concealed important documents? She considered for a moment. Charles was fascinated by hidden mechanisms. He once showed me a secret drawer in his desk, but it was empty when I checked after his death. She glanced at the grandfather clock. He particularly loved this clock, would often wind it himself, rather than allowing the servants to do so. Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. Did he follow any particular ritual when attending to it? He would check the time against his pocket watch, adjust the hands if necessary, and wind it precisely 12 turns. Never more, never less. A faint smile touched her lips. He was rather superstitious about it. Most illuminating, Holmes murmured. The sound of footsteps on the upper landing signalled the awakening of the household. Lady Eleanor glanced up nervously. I should return to my rooms. Arthur would not approve of this conversation. One final question, if I may, Holmes said quickly. The letter you received 3 days ago. Justice comes at midnight. Be prepared. Did you interpret this as a warning or a reassurance? She met his gaze directly. A promise, Mr. Holmes. One I have waited 3 years to see fulfilled. After she departed, Holmes quickly closed the clock case, ensuring everything appeared undisturbed. We have much to consider, Watson. The pieces of this puzzle are beginning to align, though the complete picture remains elusive. You believe Thomas Blackwood has returned to right some wrong? I believe Thomas never truly left, Holmes replied cryptically. Come, we should prepare for breakfast. I anticipate Sir Arthur will be most eager to hear of any progress in our investigation. As we ascended the stairs, Holmes paused, extracting the brass key he had discovered. This key, Watson, not for any door in this house, I wager, but something far more significant. What do you mean? A smile played at the corners of Holmes's thin lips. Consider the evidence. A clock that bleeds. Messages of impending justice. A hidden key crafted by the same hand that created our mysterious timepiece. We are witnessing the culmination of a plan years in the making. A plan that reaches its conclusion tomorrow night. Tomorrow? December 12th, Watson, the 3rd anniversary of Charles Blackwood's death. The final night our bleeding clock has prophesied. Whatever debt is to be collected, payment comes due at midnight tomorrow. Chapter 7. Echoes from the stream breakfast was a tense affair. Sir Arthur appeared to have slept poorly, dark circles shadowing his eyes as he picked at his food with little appetite. He inquired about our progress with forced casualness to which Holmes responded with vague assurances that he was developing several promising lines of inquiry. I recognized this evasiveness as a tactic Holmes often employed when he wished to observe a suspect's behavior unclouded by knowledge of the investigation's true direction. I should like to visit Blackwood Stream today," Holmes announced as he buttered a piece of toast. "The scene of your brother's unfortunate accident." Sir Arthur's hand froze momentarily as he raised his teacup. "I fail to see how that relates to our current situation." "Indulge me," Holmes replied with a disarming smile. "I find that understanding the history of a place often illuminates its present mysteries." After a moment's hesitation, Sir Arthur nodded stiffly. "As you wish. Thomas, the groundskeeper, can show you the way. I have business matters requiring my attention this morning." "You won't accompany us?" I asked, somewhat surprised. "I see no need to revisit painful memories, Doctor." His tone ended further discussion on the matter. An hour later, Holmes and I followed the taciturn groundskeeper along a well-worn path through the extensive woodlands of the Blackwood estate. Thomas, a weathered man of perhaps 60, with a pronounced limp, spoke little beyond answering Holmes's occasional questions about the property and local geography. "How long have you served the Blackwood family?" Holmes inquired as we descended a gentle slope towards the sound of running water. "Nigh on 40 years, sir," the man replied. "Served the old baronet before Sir Charles, and his father before him." "Then you would have known all three brothers in their youth." Thomas's leathery face creased into a frown. "Aye, that I did. Fine lads they were, before the troubles came." "Troubles?" The groundskeeper glanced over his shoulder, as though concerned about being overheard, despite our isolation. "Not my place to speak of family matters, sir." "Of course," Holmes nodded understandingly. "Though I imagine you were present when Sir Charles met his unfortunate end." Thomas stopped abruptly, turning to face us with an expression of guarded pain. "I was the one who found him, sir. Heard the shot while tending the south gardens. Terrible business. I understand he fell crossing the stream." Holmes prompted gently. "That's what they say." The man's tone carried a subtle emphasis that caught Holmes's attention. "But you have a different opinion?" Thomas hesitated, weathered fingers worrying the brim of his cap. "It's not my place to question the magistrate's findings, sir. Yet something troubles you about that day," Holmes pressed. "I assure you, we seek only the truth of what happened here." The old groundskeeper studied Holmes intently before seeming to reach a decision. Sir Charles knew these woods better than anyone. Had crossed that stream 1,000 times, never known him to slip there, especially not with a loaded gun. Where exactly did this occur? "Just ahead, sir. The stream bends around that outcropping of rocks." We continued forward until we reached a picturesque woodland stream, perhaps 15 feet across at its widest point. The water flowed swiftly over a rocky bed, with several large flat stones creating a natural crossing. "This is where Sir Charles supposedly slipped?" Holmes asked, surveying the scene critically. "Aye, sir, though the water was higher then. December rains." Holmes began a methodical examination of the area, moving with careful precision across the rocky crossing and along both banks. His keen eyes missed nothing, scrutinizing the pattern of stones, the angle of approach from the path, the line of sight from various positions along the bank. "You mentioned hearing a shot," Holmes said, kneeling to examine something at the edge of the water. "Singular? One shot?" Thomas nodded. "Just the one, sir. Came running fast as my old legs would carry me. Found Sir Charles there." He pointed to a spot near the opposite bank. "Face down in the stream he was." And Sir Arthur? Nowhere to be seen, sir. He claimed he'd gone ahead to flush out game. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, extracting his lens to examine a particular rock more closely. Most illuminating. And the hunting party? How many gentlemen participated that day? Just the two brothers, sir. Sir Arthur said the others had cancelled due to the weather. So no witnesses to the accident itself, I observed. None but the trees and the stream, Doctor, Thomas confirmed grimly. Holmes rose, brushing dirt from his knees. His expression remained neutral, though I recognized the gleam in his eyes that signified important discoveries. He extracted Sir Charles's journal from his pocket, flipping to a page he had marked earlier. Thomas, might I inquire if there are any outbuildings on the estate not currently in use? Specifically, an old mill or mechanical workshop? The groundskeeper's eyebrows rose in surprise. There's the old watermill down by the east boundary. Been abandoned since before my time. Sir Charles used to tinker there sometimes. Said he liked the solitude. Could you direct us there after we complete our examination here? Aye, sir, though it's a fair walk. While Thomas waited patiently, Holmes continued his investigation of the stream crossing, paying particular attention to the angle of approach and the surrounding vegetation. He collected several samples of soil and examined what appeared to be an old weathered mark on one of the larger trees overlooking the stream. Finally, he straightened with an air of satisfaction. I believe we've seen enough here. Shall we proceed to the mill? The path to the abandoned mill took us through a densely wooded section of the estate that clearly saw little traffic. Brambles encroached on the trail, and fallen branches lay where they had dropped, in contrast to the well-maintained paths closer to the manor house. Few visitors come this way? Holmes inquired. None, sir. The mill's been forgotten by most. Sir Charles was the only one who took an interest in the old place. After nearly 30 minutes of walking, we emerged into a small clearing where the dilapidated structure stood beside a smaller stream, diverted through an aged mill race. The wooden water wheel hung motionless, its slats rotting and broken in places. The building itself leaned slightly, its stone walls still solid, though its roof had partially collapsed at one corner. Holmes approached with evident interest, examining the padlock securing the weathered door. This lock appears relatively new, he observed. Recently maintained, would you say? Thomas shrugged. Couldn't say, sir. As I mentioned, Sir Charles was the last to use it regularly. With a meaningful glance at me, Holmes extracted the brass key we had discovered in the grandfather clock. With a satisfied nod, he inserted it into the padlock, which opened with a well-oiled click. It seems, Holmes murmured, that we are expected. The interior of the mill was far from the abandoned ruin its exterior suggested. Though dusty and cobwebbed at the periphery, a central area had been meticulously maintained. A workbench housed an array of horological tools arranged with precise care. Shelves lined one wall, holding dozens of clockwork mechanisms in various stages of completion. Most striking was a large drawing board positioned to catch the light from a high window, covered with detailed technical drawings of clock mechanisms. It says, would appear, Holmes remarked, examining the workbench with evident appreciation, that Thomas Blackwood never truly left Blackwood Manor. Good Lord, I breathed, taking in the implications. He's been here all along. Holmes nodded, his eyes alight with the thrill of confirmation. working in secret, preparing his mechanical justice, perhaps with the knowledge and assistance of his brother Charles. He lifted a dustcloth covering a large object in the corner, revealing an unfinished clock case, strikingly similar to our bleeding timepiece. But how could he remain undetected for 15 years on the estate? I wondered. Holmes indicated the collection of tools and supplies. These have been regularly maintained and used. Someone has been providing provisions and materials. He turned to Thomas the groundskeeper, who stood watching with an unreadable expression. Someone who has served the family for 40 years, perhaps. Someone who might sympathize with an unjustly treated son of the house. The old man's weathered face betrayed no emotion, but his silence was answer enough. Chapter 8. The Confession. "How long has he been here?" Holmes asked the groundskeeper directly, his tone leaving no room for further evasion. Thomas sighed deeply, the weight of long-kept secrets evident in his posture. "He never truly left, sir. After the quarrel, Master Thomas stayed with me for a fortnight while arrangements were made. Sir Charles helped him establish this workshop away from Sir Arthur's knowledge. And for 15 years you've maintained this deception?" I asked, astonished at the dedication such a scheme would require. "Master Thomas was wronged, sir," the old man replied simply. "The old baronet favoured his elder sons, especially Sir Arthur, never gave Master Thomas his due despite his gifts." His weathered hand gestured toward the intricate clockwork devices that populated the shelves. "These past 3 years, since Sir Charles's passing, he's rarely left this place." Holmes examined a stack of papers on the workbench, technical drawings, and calculations that appeared recent. "He's been planning something elaborate. These designs incorporate hydraulic mechanisms similar to those in our bleeding clock. Do you know where Thomas Blackwood is now?" I inquired of the groundskeeper. The old man shook his head. "Haven't seen him in 3 days, sir. Not since he finished work on that clock." Holmes lifted a leather-bound journal from beneath the drawings. "Watson, observe the handwriting here, identical to the notes delivered to Sir Arthur and Lady Eleanor." He flipped through several pages, his expression growing increasingly grave. "Thomas Blackwood has documented everything, the alterations to the clocks, his suspicions regarding Charles's death, and his intended reckoning with Sir Arthur." I peered at the journal. "Does it specify his plan?" "Not explicitly, but there are repeated references to mechanical justice and the midnight revelation." Holmes closed the journal carefully. "Whatever Thomas has designed, it reaches its culmination tonight at midnight, the 3rd anniversary of Charles Blackwood's death." "Should we not alert the authorities?" I suggested. "If Sir Arthur is in danger?" "I'm not convinced Sir Arthur is the intended victim," Holmes interrupted, his gaze falling on a particular passage in the journal. "Listen to this entry. C discovered the truth 2 days before his death. He confronted A, but agreed to one final hunt to discuss terms. He never returned, but the clock will speak what he cannot." "Good heavens," I muttered. "Is he suggesting Sir Arthur murdered his brother?" "The evidence increasingly points in that direction," Holmes replied grimly. "The location of Charles's death, the convenient absence of witnesses, the missing will." He turned to Thomas. "Did Sir Charles confide in you before his final hunting expedition?" The groundskeeper's face darkened with old grief. "He came to my cottage the night before, sir. agitated he was. Said he'd discovered something that changed everything. Something about Master Thomas and the family inheritance. Said he intended to make it right, but needed to confront Sir Arthur first. Holmes nodded, as though this confirmed his suspicions. And after Charles's death, did Thomas share his theories with you? He was broken by it, sir. Blamed himself for not being there to protect his brother. The old man's voice cracked slightly. That's when he began work on the clocks in earnest. Said if justice couldn't come through human means, it would come through mechanical ones. Holmes carefully placed the journal in his pocket. We must return to the manor immediately. Whatever Thomas has planned culminates tonight, and I suspect the bleeding clock is merely the harbinger of a more elaborate revelation. As we hurried back along the overgrown path, the groundskeeper maintaining a surprisingly brisk pace despite his age and limp, Holmes continued his questioning. Has Thomas left the estate at all in these 15 years? Occasionally, sir, in disguise. Travelled to London several times to acquire specialised materials. Even worked briefly at Thornwald and Sons under an assumed name to access their tools and expertise. A hint of pride tinged the old man's voice. No one recognised the youngest Blackwood with his beard and altered appearance. And Lady Eleanor, is she aware of Thomas's presence? Not to my knowledge, sir. Master Thomas insisted on absolute secrecy, even from her. Said it was safer that way. Upon reaching the manor house, we found an atmosphere of palpable tension. Jenkins informed us that Sir Arthur had locked himself in his study after receiving a telegram that had left him visibly shaken. Lady Eleanor had similarly retreated to her rooms in the east wing. The household seems to sense the approaching storm, Holmes observed as we ascended the main staircase. And I must examine the bleeding clock once more before confronting Sir Arthur. In Sir Arthur's study, the clock sat innocuously on the mantelpiece, giving no hint of its midnight transformation or the elaborate mechanism concealed within its wooden case. Holmes carefully lifted it, examining the base with renewed interest. Just as I suspected, he murmured. Watson, observe these small perforations in the base, designed to accommodate projections from another surface. He set the clock down and ran his fingers along the mantelpiece. Yes, here they are, nearly invisible indentations that align perfectly with the clock's base. What purpose would such a design serve? I inquired. I believe this clock is only half of the mechanism, Holmes replied. When properly positioned, it connects with something within or behind the mantelpiece itself. He knelt to examine the fireplace more closely. This hearth has been modified recently. Observe the newer mortar between these stones. A sharp knock interrupted his investigation. Jenkins entered, his usually impassive face betraying concern. Sir Arthur requests your presence in the library immediately, Mr. Holmes. He appears most distressed. We found Sir Arthur pacing the library, a telegram clutched in his trembling hand. His face was ashen, his earlier composure entirely abandoned. Upon our entrance, he whirled toward Holmes with the desperation of a drowning man sighting a potential rescuer. Holmes, this has gone beyond a mere prank or attempt at intimidation, he said, his voice strained. I've received confirmation that Thomas is alive and in England. I'm aware, Holmes replied calmly. In fact, Sir Arthur, your brother never left Blackwood Manor. Sir Arthur staggered as though physically struck. Impossible, He has been living and working in the abandoned mill on the eastern boundary of your estate for 15 years, with the assistance of your groundskeeper." Holmes fixed him with a penetrating stare. "Creating specialized timepieces and planning what he terms mechanical justice for his brother's death." All colour drained from Sir Arthur's face. He collapsed into a nearby chair. "Then it's true," he whispered. "He knows." "Knows what, precisely?" Holmes inquired, though his tone suggested he had already reached his own conclusions. Sir Arthur's eyes darted desperately between Holmes and myself. "You must help me, Holmes. Whatever he's planned, whatever device he's created, you must disable it before midnight." "I will consider doing so," Holmes replied coldly, "after you provide a full account of what truly happened at Blackwood Stream 3 years ago." For a long moment, Sir Arthur seemed to wage an internal battle. Then, like a dam breaking, words poured forth in a torrent of long-suppressed guilt. "It wasn't supposed to happen that way," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Charles discovered Thomas's legitimate claim to a portion of our father's fortune, a codicil to the will that had been concealed. He confronted me, threatening to expose not only this deception, but other financial irregularities he had uncovered." "So you arranged one final hunt?" Holmes prompted. Sir Arthur nodded miserably. "I intended only to reason with him, to explain that revealing such matters would destroy the family name. But Charles was adamant. We argued at the stream crossing. He turned to leave, to return to the manor and make everything public. His voice broke. I pushed him. He fell, striking, his head on the rocks. It was impulse, not premeditation. "Yet you reported it as a gun accident," I observed. "Panic," Sir Arthur whispered. "His gun discharged when he fell." I constructed a story that seemed plausible. Holmes regarded him with cold assessment. "And the missing will, the other documents that conveniently disappeared." "Self-preservation," Sir Arthur admitted. "I knew Charles had left provisions for Eleanor that would limit my control of the estate. In my desperation, I justified every action as necessary to protect the Blackwood legacy." "A legacy built on deception and fratricide," Holmes remarked pointedly. "Now, Sir Arthur, tell me exactly what was in the telegram that so alarmed you." Sir Arthur handed over the crumpled paper with trembling fingers. "It arrived an hour ago," Holmes read aloud. "The clock strikes 12. Truth flows like blood. Blackwood Stream runs red with justice. It's signed simply T.B. "What does it mean?" Sir Arthur pleaded. Holmes folded the telegram deliberately. "It means, Sir Arthur, that Thomas Blackwood has designed his mechanical justice to activate at midnight, the 3rd anniversary of the moment you took your brother's life." Chapter 9. The 11th Hour. "Blackwood Stream runs red with justice," Holmes repeated thoughtfully. "The reference cannot be coincidental. It directly connects to the site of Charles's death." Sir Arthur rose unsteadily, panic evident in his movements. "What has Thomas done? What device has he created?" "That is what we must discover," Holmes replied, consulting his pocket watch. "It is now just past 4 o'clock. We have less than 8 hours before whatever mechanism Thomas has designed activates." He turned to me. "Watson, fetch Lady Eleanor. She should be part of this discussion." Lady Eleanor received the news of Sir Arthur's confession with remarkable composure. Her green eyes betrayed a momentary flash of vindication before settling into grim determination as she accompanied me to the library. "So it's finally confirmed," she said quietly. "I've known in my heart since that day, but to hear him admit it—" She paused. "What will happen now, Doctor?" "Holmes is attempting to determine what Thomas has planned for midnight," I explained. "Whatever mechanical device he has created apparently involves both the clock and Blackwood Stream." She nodded. "Charles always said Thomas had a gift for poetic justice expressed through mechanical means. If his device is meant to bring Arthur's crime to light, it will be both ingenious and inescapable." We found Holmes examining the estate, maps while Sir Arthur sat slumped in an armchair, the picture of defeated resignation. "Ah, Lady Eleanor," Holmes greeted her. "I require your assistance. Charles's journal mentioned the old watermill and its connection to the estate's irrigation system. Was this system modified in recent years?" Lady Eleanor approached the maps. "Yes, Charles undertook extensive renovations to the water management system about 4 years ago. He diverted part of Blackwood Stream through a series of channels and holding ponds, including a connection to the old mill race," Holmes inquired. "Precisely. The mill wheel was recommissioned to pump water during heavy rains, preventing the stream from overflowing near the manor." She glanced at Sir Arthur with undisguised contempt. "Charles was always thinking of ways to protect the estate, even as his brother plotted to control it." Sir Arthur flinched but offered no rebuttal. Holmes studied the map intently. "These channels form a network throughout the estate, eventually reconnecting with the main stream near the manor house. Yes, the system includes several sluice gates that can be opened or closed to control water flow during different seasons." "And who manages these gates?" "Thomas, the groundskeeper, under Charles's direction. Since Charles's death, they've been largely left in their winter configuration." Holmes's eyes gleamed with the excitement of discovery. "Watson, recall our examination of the bleeding clock's mechanism, the hydraulic reservoir that released liquid precisely at midnight. I believe that system was merely a miniature representation of what Thomas has constructed on a much larger scale." He turned to Sir Arthur. "Your brother has engineered the estate's water system to serve as a demonstration of his mechanical justice. At midnight, I suspect sluice gates will automatically open, diverting water through channels containing evidence of your crime. What evidence could possibly remain after 3 years?" Sir Arthur protested weakly. "Lady Eleanor, did Charles keep any physical objects that might conclusively prove Sir Arthur's guilt?" She considered for a moment. "Charles was methodical about documentation. If he discovered financial irregularities, he would have preserved evidence." Her eyes widened suddenly. "The strongbox. Charles had a waterproof metal case from his army days. It disappeared after his death." Sir Arthur shook his head. "I found no such box among his effects." Holmes was already on his feet. "We must examine the water system immediately, particularly the mill and any mechanisms Thomas might have integrated into it." During the tense carriage ride to the mill, Holmes outlined his theory. Thomas Blackwood has spent 3 years refining his plan. The bleeding clock was merely the announcement, a warning to the guilty and a promise to the wronged. The true mechanism involves the estate's water system. "To what end?" I asked. "Consider the telegram's wording. I believe Thomas has constructed a system that will release evidence of Sir Arthur's crime into the stream. Evidence preserved these 3 years. When midnight strikes, this evidence will flow through the waterways, making a private crime unmistakably public. At the mill, we found the padlock hanging open. Inside, the workshop had been partially cleared, with a large section of the floor removed to reveal a complex arrangement of gears, levers, and hydraulic pistons connected to the mill wheel. Holmes knelt beside this opening. Remarkable engineering. The mill wheel connects to this timing device, which controls a series of valves and sluice gates. He indicated a large metal cylinder suspended above the mechanism. This reservoir appears designed to release its contents into the water system at a precise moment. "Midnight," I murmured. "Precisely." Holmes examined the cylinder carefully. It's connected to a clockwork timer, synchronized with both the grandfather, clock in the manor, and our bleeding timepiece. He glanced at Sir Arthur, who stood ashen-faced in the doorway. "Your brother has created a masterpiece of mechanical retribution, Sir Arthur. At midnight, the truth of your crime will indeed flow, like blood through Blackwood Stream." Chapter 10. The Final Countdown. "Can it be disabled?" Sir Arthur asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Holmes examined the mechanism with cautious admiration. "Perhaps, though not without risk. This system has been designed with remarkable precision. Any clumsy attempt to disarm it might trigger an immediate release." He pointed to a series of counterweights and tripwires. "Thomas has incorporated multiple fail-safes. Interfering with one component could activate another." Lady Eleanor approached the edge of the opening, studying the device with evident fascination. Charles often spoke of Thomas's mechanical genius. He said Thomas could make metal and water dance to his will. "Indeed," Holmes agreed. "The integration of hydraulic pressure with clockwork timing demonstrates extraordinary skill." He glanced at his pocket watch. "The question remains, what exactly will this device release into Blackwood Stream at midnight?" I peered at the metal cylinder suspended above the mechanism. "Could we simply empty that container?" "A reasonable suggestion, Watson, though I suspect it's not so straightforward." Holmes indicated several tubes connecting the cylinder to other parts of the system. "This appears to be merely one component of a larger network. The primary evidence may be elsewhere, perhaps submerged in a section of the stream itself, waiting to be disturbed by a precisely timed surge of water." Sir Arthur's face had grown increasingly pallid. What evidence could Thomas possibly have preserved? "The incident occurred 3 years ago. Charles's strong box, for one," Lady Eleanor replied coldly. "If it contained documentation of your financial irregularities and perhaps even a written account of his suspicions regarding your intentions, that alone would be damning. But there's more, isn't there?" Holmes said, directing his penetrating gaze at Sir Arthur. "You're concerned about physical evidence from the scene itself. Something that would irrefutably prove your brother's death was no accident." Sir Arthur sank onto a wooden stool, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "It doesn't matter now. I've confessed to you. I'll face the consequences of my actions." "Noble sentiments," Holmes remarked dryly, though somewhat belated. "Our immediate concern is locating Thomas Blackwood himself. This mechanism is merely the culmination of his plan. He will want to witness its execution. We conducted a thorough search of the mill and its immediate surroundings. but found no sign of either Thomas Blackwood or the elderly groundskeeper. As the afternoon light began to wane, Holmes made a decision. We must trace the water system from this point to where it rejoins the main stream. That's where we're most likely to find both Thomas and whatever evidence he has preserved. Using Lady Eleanor's knowledge of the estate and the maps we had brought from the manor, we plotted the course of the diverted waterway. From the mill, it followed a winding path through a wooded section of the estate, before joining a series of holding ponds. These, in turn, fed into the main course of Blackwood Stream, near the spot where Charles had met his death 3 years earlier. The symmetry is unmistakable, Holmes observed as we followed the narrow maintenance path alongside the watercourse. Thomas has designed his revelation to occur at the very location where the crime was committed. The December air grew increasingly chill as twilight approached. Our breath formed clouds in the fading light as we made our way through the dense woodland. Sir Arthur lagged behind, his steps growing heavier with each passing minute, as though the weight of his guilt physically oppressed him. "How much farther to the crossing?" Holmes asked as we paused briefly at a fork in the path. "Less than half a mile," Lady Eleanor replied, drawing her cloak tighter against the cold. "The stream narrows there between 2 rock formations before widening again on the manor side, the ideal location for Thomas's finale," Holmes murmured. "Restricted flow would intensify the visual impact of whatever substance he intends to release into the water." We continued in silence, the gathering darkness necessitating the lighting of the lanterns we had brought from the manor. The path grew increasingly steep and treacherous as we descended toward the stream crossing. In the distance, the gentle murmur of flowing water grew steadily louder. "Wait," Holmes said suddenly, raising his hand to halt our progress. "Listen!" We stood motionless, straining our ears. Beyond the sound of the stream, another noise became apparent. The rhythmic creak of metal against metal. "That sound," Lady Eleanor began. "Machinery," Holmes confirmed. "Recently oiled but still bearing the distinctive voice of aged components under stress." We advanced more cautiously, Holmes leading the way with his lantern held high. As we rounded a final bend in the path, the stream crossing came into view, and, with it, an extraordinary sight. The natural ford where Charles Blackwood had met his death had been transformed. A complex array of metal sluice gates now straddled the stream at its narrowest point. Above these, mounted on the rocks overlooking the crossing, stood what appeared to be a modified version of the clock from Sir Arthur's mantelpiece. Dramatically, enlarged and connected to the water control system by an intricate series of rods and cables. Kneeling beside this mechanism, making final adjustments with obvious care, was a bearded man in workman's clothing. Though his back was to us, the precision of his movements and the intensity of his focus were unmistakable. Nearby, the elderly groundskeeper stood watch, a lantern in his gnarled hand casting long shadows across the scene. "Thomas Blackwood, I presume," Holmes called out, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of the stream. The man stiffened but did not turn. After a moment's hesitation, he continued his adjustments, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "I wondered if you would solve my little puzzle, Mr. Holmes," he replied, his voice cultured despite the roughness of his appearance. "Sir Arthur must be truly desperate to have summoned the famous consulting detective. "Your mechanical ingenuity is remarkable," Holmes said, cautiously approaching the edge of the stream. "Few could have designed a system of such precision and symbolic resonance." At this, Thomas Blackwood finally turned to face us. Despite the beard and weathered complexion, his resemblance to his brothers was unmistakable. The same aquiline nose and high forehead, though his eyes burned with an intensity absent in the other Blackwoods. 15 years, Mr. Holmes," he said, quietly. 15 years of exile, and 3 years of planning since Charles's murder. Tonight, at midnight, the stream will indeed run red with justice. "Thomas," Sir Arthur spoke from behind us, his voice cracking, "I've confessed. There's no need for this elaborate demonstration." Thomas Blackwood's expression hardened. "A private confession under duress is meaningless, Arthur. Your crime demands public reckoning. At midnight, the evidence Charles collected, evidence that cost him his life, will flow through the heart of the estate for all to witness." "And what precisely is this evidence?" Holmes inquired, his tone conversational despite the tension crackling in the air. Thomas smiled thinly, gesturing toward the water. "Patience, Mr. Holmes. You'll have your answer when the clock strikes 12. Chapter 11. The Midnight Revelation. The temperature continued to drop as night fully descended upon Blackwood Estate. Our breath hung in crystalline clouds as we maintained our uneasy vigil by the stream crossing. Holmes had engaged Thomas Blackwood in a measured conversation, his approach neither confrontational nor placating, but rather that of one professional acknowledging another's expertise. The synchronization between this mechanism and the clocks in the manor is particularly impressive, Holmes observed, studying the enlarged timepiece that loomed above the water. Mechanical communication across such distance requires exceptional precision. Thomas nodded, a flicker of pride breaking through his grim determination. The grandfather clock serves as the master timepiece. A system of underground cables connects it to both the mantelpiece clock and this installation. When midnight strikes in the manor, all three will act in perfect concert. And the bleeding effect we witnessed in the smaller clock? A simplified version of what will occur here, Thomas replied, gesturing toward a series of containers positioned above the stream, though the substance is rather different. Lady Eleanor had maintained a dignified silence throughout this exchange, but now she approached Thomas directly. "You knew my husband well," she said quietly. "Would he have wanted this?" Thomas's expression softened momentarily. "Charles believed in justice, Eleanor, not vengeance. What I've created is simply a mechanism to reveal truth. Truth that would otherwise remain buried, like Charles himself." Sir Arthur, who had been standing apart from our group, suddenly stepped forward. "Thomas, I admit my guilt. I've lived with this shame for 3 years. Allow me to face my punishment through proper legal channels rather than this theatrical display." "Theatrical?" Thomas's voice hardened. "Is that how you characterize justice, Arthur? You orchestrated the perfect crime. No witnesses, no evidence. A plausible accident that fooled everyone but those who truly knew Charles." He gestured toward the elderly groundskeeper, who had maintained his silent vigil nearby. "Old Thomas here found something at the scene that day. Something you overlooked in your haste to construct your narrative. What could possibly remain as evidence after 3 years? I asked, voicing the question that hung in the chill air. Thomas smiled enigmatically. Water preserves, Dr. Watson. Particularly cold, moving water with certain mineral properties. He turned back to his brother. You were always so confident in your superiority, Arthur. So certain that your academic knowledge trumped my practical skills. But you failed to understand the basic principles of preservation and mechanical timing. Holmes had been circling the installation with measured steps, his keen eyes absorbing every detail of the mechanism. The strongbox, he said suddenly. You've submerged Charles's strongbox somewhere in this stream system, positioned to be revealed at midnight. Very good, Mr. Holmes, Thomas acknowledged with a nod, though that's merely one element of what I've arranged. The old groundskeeper spoke for the first time, his voice rough with age and emotion. Master Charles knew something was wrong before that last hunt. Gave me a letter to keep safe, he did. Said if anything happened to him, I should give it to Master Thomas. A precaution Charles took after discovering your financial manipulations, I presume, Holmes said to Sir Arthur. He anticipated danger, though perhaps not from his own brother. Sir Arthur had gone deathly pale. What does the letter say? It may not, whispered. It details your systematic embezzlement from the estate accounts, Thomas replied coldly. Funds designated for tenant improvements, diverted to cover your gambling debts. Charles discovered the discrepancies just days before his death. He paused, his gaze boring into his brother. But more importantly, it expresses his fear that you might resort to desperate measures to prevent exposure. Lady Eleanor moved to stand beside Thomas. My husband suspected his own brother might harm him. He couldn't bring himself to believe it, Thomas replied, his voice softening as he addressed her. But he was prudent enough to document his concerns and ensure the evidence would survive. Holmes checked his pocket watch. It's nearly 11 o'clock. Perhaps, Thomas, you might share precisely what you've designed this apparatus to do when midnight arrives. Thomas considered this request for a moment before nodding. At midnight, this clock will trigger a series of sluice gates upstream. Water from the holding ponds will surge through channels containing a particular mineral compound I've developed. A vivid red substance that dissolves slowly in water, creating the effect of the stream running with blood, Holmes concluded. Of fitting symbolic justice, Thomas agreed. But more significantly, the increased water pressure will disturb a section of the stream bed directly beneath where we stand, where old Thomas and I secured Charles's strongbox 3 years ago. He gestured to a metal apparatus extending into the water. This mechanical arm will retrieve and open the box, revealing its contents to be carried downstream by the crimson water, directly past the manor house, where several local officials will be waiting, summoned by telegrams sent earlier today. Sir Arthur staggered slightly. You invited witnesses. The local magistrate who dismissed Eleanor's concerns. The family solicitor who so conveniently found a revised version of Charles's will. The banker who helped you conceal your financial manipulations. Thomas's expression was implacable, all gathered to witness incontrovertible evidence of your crimes flowing past the very heart of the estate you stole. The full scope of Thomas Blackwood's plan for mechanical justice was now apparent. A public revelation that would make denial impossible, designed with the same precision and artistry as the clocks he had once crafted. Most ingenious, Holmes remarked, though I note you've incorporated a secondary timing mechanism here. connected to yet another hydraulic system. He indicated a smaller apparatus partially concealed behind the main clockwork. This serves what purpose exactly? A flicker of surprise crossed Thomas's face. The first time his composure had been disturbed. Your reputation is well deserved, Mr. Holmes. That component is insurance. Insurance that ensures your brother cannot interfere with the primary mechanism, Holmes suggested. Perhaps something more lethal than simple revelation? The atmosphere, already tense, grew suddenly charged with new danger. Lady Eleanor stepped back involuntarily, while I moved closer to Holmes, my hand instinctively reaching for the revolver in my pocket. Thomas's expression hardened. Justice sometimes requires more than mere exposure, Mr. Holmes. Charles's death was no accident, no momentary passion. It was calculated murder to conceal years of theft and deception. And you appointed yourself judge, jury, and executioner, Holmes replied evenly. I merely designed the mechanism, Thomas countered. Arthur's own actions determined the verdict. The old clock above the stream let out a groaning chime, marking the quarter hour before 11. The sound echoed through the darkness, a reminder that time, like the water flowing inexorably beneath our feet, continued its steady progress toward midnight. Chapter 12. Justice Flows. As 11 o'clock chimed from the great mechanism, a profound silence fell over our strange gathering. The night had grown bitterly cold, our lanterns creating pools of light that barely pushed back the encroaching darkness. The stream murmured its endless song, unaware of the human drama unfolding upon its banks. Holmes moved to stand beside me, speaking in a voice too low for the others to hear. Watson, position yourself near Lady Eleanor. Should matters deteriorate, rapidly ensure her safety. I nodded, understanding the gravity of his concern. Holmes then approached Thomas Blackwood with measured steps, his manner deliberately casual. Your secondary mechanism. It's designed to deliver a more permanent form of justice, is it not? Holmes gestured toward the smaller apparatus he had identified earlier. Perhaps a sudden release of water pressure directed at a specific location on the crossing, the very spot where a man might stand to interfere with the primary revelation. Thomas's eyes narrowed slightly. You perceive more than most, Mr. Holmes. A fatal surge of water, timed to coincide with the revelation, Holmes continued. Poetic, in its way. Arthur dying as Charles did, in the same stream, at the same time of night, 3 years later. Charles didn't simply die, Thomas replied coldly. He was murdered, pushed against the rocks with sufficient force to fracture his skull before he entered the water. He turned to Sir Arthur, whose face had gone ashen. Old Thomas found traces of blood on the upper rocks, blood that should not have been present had Charles simply slipped and fallen as you claimed. Sir Arthur swayed slightly. It was never my intention. Spare us your excuses, Thomas cut him off. Your intention was to silence Charles before he could expose your theft. You succeeded in that, at least temporarily. Lady Eleanor had been listening intently, her composure remarkable despite the emotional turbulence of these revelations. Now she stepped forward, addressing Thomas directly. I want justice for Charles, not another death. Her voice was steady, though I detected the faintest tremor beneath her controlled exterior. Whatever Arthur has done, His fate should be determined by law, not machinery. Thomas's expression softened momentarily as he regarded her. The law failed you, Eleanor. It failed Charles. When traditional justice proves inadequate, alternative mechanisms become necessary. Holmes had been circling the apparatus with careful steps, studying its components with evident interest. The engineering is flawless, he remarked, a testament to your skill and dedication. Yet I wonder if Charles would recognize this as justice rather than vengeance. Charles was the gentlest of us, Thomas acknowledged, a fleeting vulnerability crossing his features. Always believing in the fundamental decency of others, a belief that ultimately cost him his life. As midnight drew nearer, the tension beside the stream grew increasingly palpable. Sir Arthur had sunk to his knees on the damp ground, all pretense of dignity abandoned. The groundskeeper maintained his silent vigil, his weathered face betraying neither approval nor condemnation of the unfolding events. 11:30, Holmes announced, consulting his pocket watch. Thomas, I put it to you directly. Will you deactivate the lethal component of your mechanism? Allow your evidence to speak for itself without adding fratricide to the night's revelations. For several long moments, Thomas Blackwood remained silent, conflicting emotions warring across his face. Finally, he spoke. You disappoint me, Mr. Holmes. I expected you to understand the necessity of absolute justice. I understand that justice without mercy becomes merely another form of cruelty. Holmes replied evenly. Your brother's actions were reprehensible, but answering one death with another will not restore what was lost. Thomas turned away, his attention returning to his elaborate mechanism. Some actions cannot be forgiven, Mr. Holmes. Some debts can only be paid in full measure. Holmes caught my eye, a subtle signal passing between us. With deliberate casualness, he moved to position himself between Thomas and the dangerous apparatus. I, meanwhile, edged closer to Lady Eleanor, prepared to draw her to safety should circumstances deteriorate. As the quarter hour chimed, a new sound reached us. Voices and movement from the direction of the manor. Lanterns bobbed in the distance as a group made their way along the path towards the stream crossing. Ah, Thomas observed with grim satisfaction. The witnesses arrived precisely on schedule. Through the trees emerged a small procession, the foggy magistrate, a portly man with an expression of annoyed confusion, the family solicitor, thin and nervous, and two other gentlemen I took to be local notables. Jenkins the butler guided them, his normally impassive face taut with tension. What is the meaning of this summons? The magistrate demanded, then fell silent as he took in the extraordinary scene. The massive clock mechanism looming over the stream, Sir Arthur on his knees, and the confrontation clearly underway. Gentlemen, Thomas greeted them with cold formality. You have been invited to witness the revelation of evidence concerning the death of Sir Charles Blackwood 3 years ago. Evidence that will demonstrate conclusively that his death was neither accident nor misadventure, but murder. The magistrate sputtered in indignation. This is most irregular. If you have evidence, it should be presented through proper channels. The proper channels failed, Thomas interrupted, just as they failed when Lady Eleanor raised her concerns 3 years ago. Tonight, the evidence speaks for itself. He turned to the butler. Jenkins, have the staff gathered at the manor's stream-side terrace, as instructed? Yes, sir. Jenkins replied. "The household is assembled, awaiting the midnight hour." Thomas nodded with satisfaction. "Excellent. Justice will have its audience." Holmes had been watching this exchange with sharp attention. Now he moved with sudden decision, approaching Thomas directly. "I believe I've identified the deactivation sequence for your secondary mechanism," he said quietly. "The question is whether I should employ it." Thomas regarded him with surprise that quickly transformed into something like respect. "You continue to exceed expectations, Mr. Holmes. But consider carefully before interfering. Some forms of justice transcend conventional morality. And some forms of vengeance masquerade as justice," Holmes countered. "I put it to you one final time. Allow your evidence to condemn your brother without adding his blood to that already staining this stream." The great clock began to chime the 3/4 hour. 15 minutes remained until midnight would bring Thomas Blackwood's mechanical justice to fruition.